You're listening to the 13th module of the International Security course. In this module, we will begin the first of two units that focus on the problem of terrorism. This problem is sufficiently large enough that it's worth our time to take two modules to explore some of the various facets of this particular challenge to international security. In this particular module, we're going to begin by defining terrorism and looking at some of the motivations, philosophies, and objectives of terrorism. And then we're going to look at the relationship between terrorism and the state, and how the state both uses terrorism for its own ends and is the victim of terrorism. It's probably best to begin our look at terrorism with a definition of terrorism. And one of the things we're going to notice immediately is the difficulty of coming to a broad consensus of what terrorism actually is. Perhaps the most logical place to start is to look at what certain states say about terrorism. How do they define terrorism? And I've given two examples here. One comes from the US State Department, which defines terrorism as the calculated use or threat of violence to inculcate fear, intended to coerce or intimidate governments or societies. Below that is the definition used by the United Kingdom and their foreign ministry. They define it as the use or threat for the purpose of advancing a political, religious, or ideological course of action of serious violence against any person or property. Notice that UK definition is a lot more, is much broader in that one could theoretically engage in acts of graffiti. And if you read the UK definition loosely enough, that person could be guilty of terrorism. So hopefully these two definitions placed side by side, two states that are allies with each other and see the world in relatively similar ways, have come up with two fairly different definitions of terrorism. And in fact, we could look at definitions of terrorism within the other agencies of the US government, the FBI, the Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security, various police agencies. And you'd find, on the one hand, a definition that follows the basic contours of what we see here, but would also have certain details and certain specifics that would be different than how it's defined in other places. So terrorism really is an idea that seeks out a definition. There's not a complete consensus, a universal consensus on what terrorism is. Given this lack of complete consensus on the definition of terrorism, perhaps a better way of cutting into the problem is to look at what are the basic elements of terrorism. What do you need to have for something to be possibly classified as terrorism? It still may not be terrorism, but if you have all these elements there, you at least have something that might be classified as terrorism. First off, terrorism is about spreading fear. It's about using certain violent means to spread a fear, a panic, a feeling of uncertainty in a particular targeted community or population. Secondly, terrorism is about illegitimate violence. And it's important here to focus on this word illegitimate because that's what makes terrorism different than other types of violence that the state often uses. Terrorism is not war. The world accepts that war sometimes takes place, in part because we accept the fact that states have the right to use violence when it's in their interests. We prefer that they don't use violence, but if the state declares war on another state, that's not seen as illegitimate. Whereas with terrorism, these are non-state entities, and as a result, they don't have the right to use violence. They need to seek other political avenues to realize their objectives. Indeed, having political objectives is another element of terrorism. Setting off bombs and killing people just for the fun of it, just for the sake of killing them, is not terrorism. It may be something else that's quite disgusting and quite crude and quite horrendous, but it's not terrorism. And this leads to some problems with regards to people who shoot up schools or shoot up workplaces, or the Las Vegas shooter. What was there a political objective behind that, or was it just some person who's deranged or somehow lacking in some mental capacity, shooting people for no reason at all? If that's the case, then is that terrorism? There's no political objective there. So it technically, according to this view, is not terrorism. Lastly, we have the notion of civilian targets, that non-state actors going after military targets is more difficult to define as terrorism than actors going after civilian targets. If a group of counterinsurgents strap bombs to their bodies and try to blow up a tank or an armored car or a platoon of troops, that's more difficult to define as terrorism than those same individuals attacking a bus full of commuters or a shopping mall or something of that sort. In order for terrorism to be terrorism from this viewpoint, these four elements have to exist. Terrorism also has a process. Each terrorist event tends to follow a similar protocol. The first, obviously, is the actual act of terror, which is designed to shock and to grab attention. If a terrorist engages in an act of violence that doesn't get any attention, then that terrorist has failed, regardless of how many people it winds up killing, or how much damage it does. If it doesn't grab media attention or some other kind of large mass attention on the part of the population, then the terrorist hasn't accomplished its objective. Once you have succeeded in grabbing people's attention through this act of violence, there's the messaging stage, claiming responsibility and explaining why you engaged in this act of terrorism in the first place. And then finally, there is the reaction to the terrorist attack. What does the state do once the attack takes place and certain groups have claimed responsibility and explained why they are engaging in that particular act? Does the state do nothing? Does it change its laws? Does it change its policies? Does it invade a country that it believes is harboring terrorists or supporting terrorists somehow? Whatever it is, this is the action or lack of action is part of this larger terrorist process. So when we look at the first point, getting attention, the best way to get attention is to engage in an act that transcends the limits of what's socially acceptable in terms of that particular act. And obviously, since killing and murdering large numbers of people is not considered socially acceptable, that's one reason why terrorists choose to engage in this sort of action. Of course, killing people isn't necessarily the only way to do this, but it turns out to be the best way and the easiest way to conceptualize. There's no thought necessarily involved in trying to figure out how do we shock people, how do we get their attention. Let's kill a bunch of people. That will definitely get people's attention. That will get the attention of the media, and we'll find ourselves with a platform as a result. Beyond simply getting the attention of media and the people at large, there's also a sense that you have to go beyond simply getting their attention and to shake them out of the tedium of their daily routines, to upend their idea of what's considered normal, to give the impression that somehow, as a result of this attack or these series of attacks, life is no longer the same. life is fundamentally changing. What's considered normal is no longer normal. It's something that's now in the past. And this explains things like the 9/11 attacks, where all these efforts to gain attention, whether it's causing mass casualties, capturing the attention of the media, and giving this people a sense that nothing is the same after this event, were more or less met. And obviously that's the reason why September 11th is considered sort of the ultimate act of terror that may never be exceeded. Also very important is the messaging that takes place once an act has successfully been promulgated. In many ways, this is more important because there's no real point in engaging in the terrorist act in the first place if you don't have some message to communicate once you have that spotlight. Terrorist acts that don't have any kind of message behind them, either because the group doesn't think it needs to communicate or doesn't want to communicate or fails to communicate its message, are called unsigned acts. And what happens is that the victims or the observers of the attack will try to speculate as to what the motivation is, to what the message is. And inevitably they will speculate incorrectly. So most terrorist attacks have some kind of signature, an identification of who is responsible for the act and why they engaged in the act in the first place. Indeed, with ISIS, we see that oftentimes they will sign a violent act that they may in fact have had nothing to do with. We see this with the Las Vegas shooter. The ISIS claimed responsibility for the Las Vegas massacre, even though pretty much all experts agree that it's unlikely, highly unlikely, that ISIS had anything to do with it. The shooter in Las Vegas was someone who was obviously disturbed in multiple ways and had nothing and was not in any way inspired or motivated by watching ISIS propaganda, or did not travel to Syria to endure ISIS training. ISIS had nothing to do with that attack. But it also speaks to the importance of messaging here, because if you don't send your message, other people will claim your attack, and that's not what you want if you're trying to put forth a message. Then there are the consequences of the attack, and here we're focusing usually on the state that's been the victim of the attack, or the attack has occurred within the borders of that state. What's the reaction of that state? What's the reaction of that society when they are victims of a terrorist attack? Does the public choose to support the state and support the community, support the society that the terrorists have attacked? Or do they support the terrorists? Oftentimes, as we'll see, terrorists engage in attacks against the society as a way of dividing it, as a way of splitting it. And if there's not a unified expression of support against the terrorists, then the terrorists have accomplished their mission in that regard. Also important are the countermeasures that are often justified in the wake of a terrorist attack. Here we can think about the National Security Organization, or agency I should say, and the revelations of Edward Snowden, and the ability of the NSA to grant itself the power to spy on Americans, to spy on foreigners, to download and read their internet histories and communications, all these other things, all done in the name of keeping people safe from terrorists. Let's briefly talk about strategy and the reasons why terrorists engage in the acts that they do. The book talks about the notion of the philosophy of the bomb, which is kind of a script that many terrorists will follow in the hopes of trying to maximize their influence and power in the state or society that they're operating in. Again, terrorist acts are about seizing attention, about seizing the spotlight from where it normally is pointed in order to put forth some kind of a message. The idea here is that these messages will highlight a problem or a contradiction or an issue that is largely getting ignored by the public. That if the public knew about this issue, they would be just as outraged as the perpetrators of the attack are. That if they recognize that the country, the state they live in is not free, is oppressing people, they'll be drawn to the cause of the terrorist. That they will see, they'll recognize that using violence against this oppression is empowering to them, is liberating, that they'll no longer sort of be these docile sheep that are being oppressed by the state. As the state reacts to the terrorist attacks, the expectation is, and this is an important point, the expectation is that the state will overreact to the terrorist attack, that the terrorists are actually quite weak, but the state will sort of give them far more credit and power than they actually wield, and will, in so doing, make them more threatening and more powerful than they actually are. And that as the terrorists continue to prosecute their campaign, they will ultimately, as they win the support of the people, damage the legitimacy of the state to the point where social order and the legitimacy of state institutions begins to decay and perhaps even crumble. At this point, the hope is the masses will then be drawn to the cause of the terrorists, that they will support the cause of the terrorists, and that in fact the terrorists will cease to be terrorists at this point. They will now be freedom fighters. They will be insurgents worthy of some kind of support and admiration, and that their political objectives with the support of the people will be realized, and the government will change, a revolution will take place, whatever it is that the terrorists are seeking. This strategy can be applied for a number of different objectives. And if we look at all the terrorist groups in the last few decades, we can sort of boil down some of their objectives in the following categories. First off, terrorist violence, especially in places like Algeria during the 1950s and 60s, was about actually creating cohesion. It wasn't about splitting populations or doing damage to infrastructure to stir fear. It was actually designed to inspire people, to create unity among a group of people who were the subject of colonization. In the case of Algeria, French colonization. When the people who are oppressed by the French see the freedom fighters, the terrorists, attacking French soldiers, attacking even French civilians, and places where French civilians hang out, like discos and cafes, they will see that, there are elements among us who are powerful or have the ability to damage the French state, French society, and we can support them, we can help them, and throw off this colonial burden and assert our own independence. Other objectives for terrorists is to intimidate social groups rather than bring them on and create unity. It's to intimidate them into submission, and get them to submit to an agenda or an ideology that they don't necessarily want to submit to. The Taliban in Afghanistan prior to the US invasion in 2001 used terrorist acts for this purpose. They used violence and intimidation and brutality to ensure that the population submitted to their very strict interpretations of Islam and how those strict interpretations should structure and function in society. Thirdly, terrorist attacks and violence can be used to spark a new conflict or expand an existing one. This is Al-Qaeda's reason for engaging in the attacks against the United States. The feeling was that the cause of trying to spread a more strict interpretation of Islam in the Middle East, trying to get states like Egypt and Algeria and Libya and other Arab states to adopt more fundamentalist principles in their government wasn't working. And so that this struggle that was taking place and relegated to the Middle East had to be expanded in order to meet with success. It had to be expanded in order to, again, going back to your first point, show the world and show those who potentially would support Al-Qaeda that they are more powerful than they actually are, and that they can strike the United States, one of the most powerful nation in the world. If they can do that successfully, then people will rally to their cause, and a new front can open in this struggle. Terrorists also use violence to try to destroy or ruin some kind of process that's already been started, whether it's a process that's peaceful or still quite contentious. Terrorism is an attempt to derail that process, trying to lead to some kind of solution. Here we can think of Northern Ireland, where the original founding of the Irish Republic left out the 6 counties in the north, which created the Republic of Northern Ireland. This was unacceptable to many Irish, both in the north and in Ireland proper. And so the ongoing efforts between Ireland, Northern Ireland, and Great Britain to deal with this problem were always tampered with by the existence of the Irish Republican Army. And any time that Ireland and more moderate forces in Northern Ireland and Great Britain came to a consensus or were trying to negotiate some kind of agreement, the IRA would strike, trying to disrupt those that consensus or that movement towards consensus, because they didn't want any compromise. They wanted Northern Ireland to join with the larger Irish Republic. Anything less than that would be unacceptable. In the Middle East, we see examples of terrorists trying to outbid a rival group, trying to show that they are in fact the true bearers of a particular ideology or a particular mission. Think about some of the Palestinian groups in Israel and the occupied territories around Israel. Here we're talking about the tension between Hamas and Fatah, where in the case of Hamas, that's rejected the idea of even acknowledging Israel as a state, and have in the past, and one would assume in the future, because they haven't sworn off violence, embrace terrorism as a way of showing that they are the true boosters, the true bearers of the cause of Palestinian independence. Whereas Fatah, which has sworn off violence, recognizes Israel and has chosen a more political route to realize Palestinian liberation, are seen as sellouts, that Hamas is trying to portray them as sellouts, and that all good Palestinians will support Hamas in the cause of Palestinian liberation. And finally, some terrorist actions are purely about spectacle and trying to gain public attention. We've already established that all terrorism is about getting attention, but some terrorist attacks and groups are specifically focused on just this objective. Think about airline hijacking in the 1980s, where you had, it seemed like every month, another airliner being hijacked. Whether it was in Algeria, Lebanon, Greece, Italy, and Rome, airliners were hijacked quite a bit in the 1980s, even before that. One of the reasons why 9/11 was a successful attack is because we had seen hijacking so often that we assumed that when we found out the airlines were hijacked, or the people who were on board those planes realized that they were being hijacked, they say, we know how this goes. They're taking over the plane. They're going to fly us somewhere else. We're going to land. There's going to be a big media circus, and eventually they're going to let us go. And it soon became soon they realized, obviously, that this was not the case, that this wasn't just about gaining attention. It was about, transforming these airliners into actual weapons. So, who are the terrorists? The first thing we should understand when we talk about who the terrorists are is that they are not people who are evil looking or are inherently evildoers. There's a tendency with all the focus on ISIS to think of terrorists as Arab men with long beards and dressed in an exotic way. And that's a very deceptive picture. Most terrorists are very ordinary people with ordinary looks. The picture here is a young Timothy McVeigh. Timothy McVeigh, of course, was the bomber of the federal building in Oklahoma City. Whatever their looks, they are true believers. They believe devoutly in the cause. And if, depending on how that cause is understood, they aren't terrorists, they are freedom fighters. And it's sort of the classic way of understanding this question about who are terrorists. Because one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. Oftentimes, terrorists are people who turn to terrorism because they're living in an oppression, in an oppressed environment. And in these cases, the political philosopher Frantz Fanon, who's pictured here, argues that they engage in violence as a way of asserting their subjectivity, as a way of asserting their independent consciousness. That engaging in terrorist acts is a way of them throwing off their neuroses, their colonial neuroses. That the act of violence is necessary for them to gain autonomy over their mind and autonomy over their body. But there's a question, of course, what kind of oppression are we talking about? In the case of Algeria, the context that Fanon is talking about, you're talking about a large population of indigenous Algerians who have been living under French colonial rule for several decades, actually, 2 centuries. In the case of, let's say, the Brigate Rosse, an Italian terrorist group that's made up primarily of middle-class youth, are these people generally oppressed? That terrorism is something that's deemed necessary? It's a more difficult argument to make in that case. Terrorists are innovators. They are individuals who find new ways of causing death and destruction through adapting new technologies and applying those new technologies in ways that were not originally anticipated by the people who invented those technologies or developed them. They are the ones that learn to stalk prey from a distance and to use rifles, assassin's bullets to take out those they deem unworthy or needing to be destroyed. They are the ones that experiment with explosives, taking existing explosives like dynamite or some kind of plastic explosive and trying to place it in an unorthodox location in order to take out a specific target. They're the ones that see an airliner not as a mode of transportation but as a weapon that can be used to destroy a building, for example. And they're the ones that are interested in actually using weapons of mass destruction to actually cause damage, not as merely a deterrence capability. Let's move now to looking at how terrorism and the state interact with each other. There's a tendency to see terrorism as something that is a threat to the state, and indeed, oftentimes, that's not an inaccurate way of looking at it. But we also have to understand that terrorism and the state sometimes go together. In fact, terrorism, the idea of terrorism, emerges from those who have taken control of the state, who wish to take control of the state, using violence in a particular way, and actually boasting about the fact that they are, in fact, terrorism. That terrorism is, in fact, a method of rule. that they use the tools of the state, the power of the state, to destroy what they see as a more powerful social enemy. Terrorism is a way of capturing the institutions of the state and getting rid of or dethroning or toppling what they see as an unjust government. Indeed, again, when we first start using the word terrorism in the modern sense, we are using it to describe ways the state used terror. And the first example of this is the French Revolution. And we'll talk more about that here in a moment. We'll talk more about all these various examples. But we can begin by looking at the various reigns of terror beginning in France, in Nazi Germany, in Stalinist ruled Russia, and in several countries in Latin America throughout the Cold War. So let's go to France again, where this all kind of begins. And we can see that terrorism is for the French revolutionaries, particularly the Jacobins, who believe that the changes that the revolution is trying to realize are happening too slowly, embrace terrorism and do so happily and willingly. They happily call themselves terrorists. If someone accuses them of being a terrorist during this time period, they will say, "Thank you very much. You're right. I am a terrorist." Why do they accept this term? Because for them, the term is about using a particular method of political action to realize in their mind a very noble goal of toppling the aristocracy and establishing a more republican form of rule. Specifically, you have organizations during the French Revolution using practices like the guillotine to destroy their enemies, destroy the enemies of early Republican France. Groups like the Committee on Public Safety, which killed anyone that they merely suspected of collaborating with the old aristocratic regime. To be accused by the Committee on Public Safety of collaboration was essentially a death sentence. There was, of course, a show trial, but once you were found guilty, you were marched out to the plaza and you were publicly executed. Again, I want to emphasize that terrorism was something that the French revolutionaries, the more radical French revolutionaries at least, embraced. They owned up to being terrorists. They liked being terrorists. You can see their quotes here, examples of this. Terror, according to Robespierre, is only justice, prompt, severe, and inflexible. It is then an emanation of virtue. It is less a distinct principle than a natural consequence of the general principle of democracy applied to the most pressing wants of the country. If you believed in democracy, according to Robespierre here, you were a terrorist. And not because you were using violence, but because the best way to realize democracy was through the processes of terror. Another French revolutionary, Saint-Just, a nation regenerates itself only upon heaps of corpses. In the same spirit, Jean-Paul Marat, I believe in the cutting off of heads. Why did they so gleefully own up to this? Why did they so gleefully embrace this? Because they believed being a terrorist, the methods of terrorism were the best ways to create a quote-unquote free French Republic. It shouldn't be surprising then that when we move forward a few hundred years and find ourselves in the early 20th century, that a similar attitude will be adopted by the Nazis, where again, they will embrace violence. They will not simply embrace the word terrorism, but they will embrace that spirit of using violence to destroy enemies in order to create a better state, in order to purge, in the case of the Nazis, those who are seen as tainting the genetic purity of the state through violent means. This quote here obviously refers to Jews and the belief Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf that the Jews are a menace to the genetic purity of Germany, that the Jews are stars of conflict, stars of war, extenders of war. That's what those German words mean there on the bottom. And that therefore the tactics of terror are justified to destroy them. And if you identify an enemy in your midst that must be destroyed, notice what happens. You essentially begin to militarize the society itself. Enemies everywhere mean those institutions with the right to use violence have to be mobilized to destroy the enemies that are deployed everywhere. So that means society becomes militarized. And if you think about, again, about Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, both totalitarian societies, notice how everything becomes militarized. The bus drivers, the teachers, everyone in the party has to join the Nazi party. The distinction between civilian and military, police and military, begins to blur, and constant scrutiny is necessary in order to identify who the enemies are and to take measures to stop them. What we see in Nazi Germany is also observable in Stalin's Russia, most especially during the Great Purge that took place between 1926 and 1933, where in order to collectivize farming, Stalin used this power of the state to essentially push anywhere between 2 to 7 million Ukrainian farmers off their land in Ukraine primarily, which resulted in them starving to death. That they were even allowed to keep their land, all the produce of that land, all the food that was produced was seized by the state, and nothing was left for the farmers themselves, the workers themselves, so they starved to death. Which raises the question that this is not necessarily terrorism, this is more of an eliminationist policy. It's not terrorism in the sense that it's sort of what more wildcat violence. Terrorism is, as we described earlier, kind of irregular violence or of illegitimate violence. Because this is the state, it's less terrorism and more eliminationist policy. And that may be the case. Again, one of the ideas we're playing with in this module is the difficulty of nailing down the definition of terrorism. During the Cold War, we see some smaller scale type of state terrorist activity in Latin America especially, with the arrival of certain juntas and other authoritarian governments, which engage in a series of oppressive acts, mass arrests, mass surveillance, disappearing individuals who were seen as enemies of the state, which meant anything from throwing them in jail and basically leaving them there to starve to death, or actually taking them someplace isolated and killing them there with no notification of their whereabouts or notification to family members of what happened to them. That these types of acts also constitute a type of state terrorism. When the state uses terrorism, it's usually in an attempt to protect itself from a change in government. We see this with France. We see this to a certain extent in Stalin's Russia, Hitler's Germany. And we definitely see it in Latin America, where insurgents and coup plotters engage in a violent act to seize the power of the state, and then turn around once they have seized control of the state and use the state institutions of violence in the state, the police and the military, to crack down on any type of counterpunch, any type of reaction to their seizure of the control of the state. We can see this in Chile in 1973, where you have a overthrow of the government of Salvador Allende in 1973, and in an attempt to consolidate that rule, in order to protect that rule from a period of vulnerability after power is seized, the tactics of terror are utilized to protect that fledgling rule. In the case of Chile, it was 40,000 arrests, with hundreds of those people arrested, tortured, and killed, and otherwise dispatched. It's believed, the total death toll of the Chilean coup, the protection of Pinochet's regime in the early days after the coup was in the thousands. And again, is this terrorism or is this simply the state being violent? Let's turn now to the idea of terrorism as a form of resistance to the state, of terrorism as a way of not necessarily trying to change the state, but as a way of resisting the power of the state. And here we can turn to the anarchists in Russia of between 1870 and 1914, who, again, aren't trying to necessarily destroy the state, but are trying to resist what they see as corruption among the government. We can also look at what we might call anti-bourgeois groups of the 1960s and 70s. These are primarily middle-class groups who want to damage the states and its collaboration with corporations and capitalists in the 1960s and 70s. So in the late 19th and early 20th century was sort of the golden age of Russian anarchism, where you had a lot of radical thinkers and radical activists who wanted to destroy the czarist rule of Russia. And in an effort to do that, embraced a particular form of terrorism where they would make bombs and literally throw them at the czar as his entourage moved by in a public capacity. What made these guys interesting was that they were very much focused on the moral questions of their activities. And again, this might seem counterintuitive. If they're terrorists, obviously they have no morals. But you have to remember that for the terrorists, from the point of view of the so-called terrorists, they see their actions as very moral, and they put a lot of thought into maximizing what they see as the means with the ends. So in the case of the Russian anarchists, they ask the question, if I have a bomb that I'm ready to throw, do I throw it if I see that the Tsar's son is with him as he is paraded down the street? And for many Russian anarchists, including this one, Ivan Kalyev, the answer was no, you don't throw that bomb. You potentially hold on to it even after you've lit the fuse and let it kill yourself rather than destroy, in this case, an innocent victim. And we have to remember that these anarchists were not just a problem in Russia or Europe. We had anarchists in this country, and they did quite a bit of damage in the late 19th and early 20th century. President McKinley, you might know, was assassinated out by Niagara Falls in 1901. What you might not know is that he was killed by an anarchist. He was assassinated by someone who was trying to overthrow the assemblage of the American government at the time, largely in the name of trying to put power in the hands of organized labor. But these anarchists gave way after the Russian Revolution to communists, or those who accused certain insurgents in Latin America of being communists and being terrorists as well, people like Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, Mao Zedong. And it wasn't just these all-stars of communism, it was lesser-known figures like the Brazilian Carlos Marighella, who talked about the urban poor in the favelas of Rio attacking City Hall and trying to overthrow the power of the rulers there. But again, is this terrorism or is this revolution? Is this insurgency? And, where do we draw the lines? How do we make the definitions? Things really get interesting when you start looking at what we can call anti-bourgeois terrorism. These are groups that are ostensibly Marxist, but they don't really take the Marxist part seriously. They're more about creating a spectacle to act as a counter to what they see is the extravagances of consumer society, of the decadence of middle class life in Western Europe and the United States. Here we can talk about certain European terror gangs, gangs because they literally are a group of bored middle class youth. And in the United States, the example of this was the Weather Underground and a few other affiliated groups like the Symbionese Liberation Army. In the case of the first category, the terror gangs, we see several examples in Western European countries. In France, you have the Action Directe, which was set off several bombs and engaged in several assassination attempts to resist what they saw as the Americanization of Europe. In Germany, you had the Baader-Meinhof gang, which was, again, a rejection of consumerism and boredom. This was a key concept for a lot of radicals in the 1960s, the idea that meaning and purpose had been drained from life as a result of consumerism, as a result of the rise of the shopping mall and empty leisure time and quite literally boredom. And so the only way to sort of make life interesting again was to go out and set off bombs and try to destroy icons of consumerism. The group that was sort of the most hardcore and probably the most the group that was closest to an actual ideology of revolution was the Italian group, the Brigate Rosse, the Red Brigades, who were the most active and the most damaging and deadly of the terror gangs in the 1970s in Europe. It's believed that they were responsible for over 2,700 incidents in the 1970s. And I mentioned in the United States there were similar groups, although they never really were as big and certainly not as deadly and powerful as the European version of these groups. One example was the Symbionese Liberation Army, which was famous for capturing the rich heiress Patty Hearst and allegedly brainwashing her and giving her a gun and forcing her to rob banks with them. Another group that got a lot of attention during the 2008 presidential campaign was the Weather Underground, who actually set off bombs and blew up banks in the 1960s. They were sort of a splinter group from the regular radicals of the 1960s who were devoted to nonviolent resistance and whatnot. The Weather Underground believed that, against a regime that was being violent in Vietnam, the only language they would understand was violence as well. And so they believed you had to actually physically attack the institutions of capital and the government in the 1960s. The most famous individual, the most famous leader of the Weather Underground was a guy by the name of Bill Ayers. He's the guy on the left in the picture. He lives in Chicago, and he was accused of, or actually Barack Obama, the candidate, was accused of palling around with Bill Ayers in Chicago because Bill Ayers, after he gave up his terrorist past, settled down and became some regular middle-class dude, and was actually on the school board, I believe, in Chicago, and served alongside Obama before he became active in national politics. And because of this, this crossing of their paths, I believe it was Sarah Palin accused Obama of palling around with terrorists because he, again, had served on this school board with Bill Ayers. But again, the question becomes, is this kind of violence terrorism? Are bored middle-class kids and young adults running around setting off bombs in shopping malls genuine terrorism, or is it just a particular nefarious form of pranksterism, or just straight crime, rather than this more loaded concept of terrorism? We'll look more at this concept of terrorism and some other examples and other types of terrorism with regards to religion and nationalism in the next module.